I'm delighted to kick off our first presenter tonight, Caroline Dench, who may be familiar to many of you. Caroline is Adjunct Associate Professor in UCD, and she is the coordinator of the Callan Institute and has been involved with the Callan since 1997. Caroline is going to bring her extensive experience as a psychologist, as a practitioner and trainer and lecturer, both in Ireland and the United States. And she is assisted in the development of positive behavioural support and relationships and sexuality for people with intellectual disability. And the topic of Caroline's talk tonight is creating time, that is trauma-informed mindful events for facilitating the well-being of individuals with intellectual disability, their families and their support network. Caroline, thank you so much for starting off our evening.
Thank you very much, Fiona, and thank you to Leslie and to the Research Foundation for convening this evening. And I'm just going to share my screen now. So that should be okay for everybody to see. So Callan Institute is a very small department within St. John of God Community Services, and we're a team of 4 practitioners. So just to acknowledge my colleagues, Gillian Martin, Christina Doody and Lisa Condren, and we're supported by Administrative Assistant Carol May. So we're a very small team, and as part of what we do within St. John of God Community Services, we think about behavioural support needs. So people who are evidencing their story through behavioural support needs. So when we think about trauma-informed mindful environments, we sometimes think about what's happening maybe inside the therapy room, but also outside the therapy room, which is much broader, isn't it? Because we're now thinking about life. So when we support somebody who has experienced trauma, we're thinking in a very systemic way. We're thinking in a very creative, system-wide way to think about how can the individual, together with their circle of support, recover, build resilience, and think about developing their capacity to actually live well. I'm going to speak today in the context of children and adults with an intellectual disability. And I suppose the research in this area for people with an intellectual disability is a little bit overwhelming, because the indicators are that this population are much more likely to experience trauma than people without an intellectual disability. So I'm using photo symbols this evening. So the images that you see come from Photo Symbols, which is a directory library of images. So I want to kind of convey to you this idea that trauma comes from it's Greek. The word is Greek. The origins are Greek, and it means wound. So Fiona, Professor McNicholas talked there just around this idea of psychological, emotional, cognitive, mental, spirituality, impact. So trauma is best understood as something that was unprepared, unexpected, you had no way of preventing it, and it actually overwhelmed you. And it can overwhelm you in a way that is both acute and chronic. So when we think about trauma, we think about sometimes the immediacy of it, and we might pull upon psychological first aid, for example. But then we also think about trauma more from its chronicity. So how do we live with trauma 2 months later, 3 months later, 3 years later? So we've got this differentiation between the immediacy and the long term. And Tara Brauch talks just beautifully about trauma. I'm just going to move the images here because they're blocking my slide. Trauma is when we've encountered an out of control, frightening experience that has disconnected us from all sense of resourcefulness, our safety, our coping, our love. So trauma-informed care as a concept it was coined by Fallet and Harris, and actually the article they wrote in 2001 was Harris and Fallet, so they've collaborated quite a bit on this area, and they've key principles that are evidenced in a trauma-informed care model. And I've just looked at this through the idea of time, trauma-informed mindful environments. So these 5 principles are safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. Now, they've lots of different resources in this area. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, time won't permit. But you get this idea of everything that we do when we're thinking about a trauma-informed mindful environment evidences these 5 principles all the time. So they are non-linear, as in they are interdependent, they coexist together. And I'm reminded by a lovely example of one of our services in the UK that supports people with food poverty. And what they have set up is a supermarket. So instead of maybe handing out food parcels, you book your slot in the supermarket and you come in and you have choice. You actually can look at what you might like to have in the supermarket next week. So this idea of the 5 principles being embedded in a food poverty support is really evidenced in this model of support that our service in UK is modelling. Now, this happens everywhere, but I just think that's a lovely example of how we think about it. So when I talk about overwhelmed, and this is hard to talk about, that neurologically your brain changes when something happens to you that is unprepared, unexpected, and you couldn't protect yourself. And neurologically, our lower brainstem actually goes into the fight, flight, freeze, or flop. So this idea of our arousal system being so disrupted and interrupted is really significant, because that imprint can actually be very relevant in the whole recovery and support and living with my story now embodied. So when we hear about this idea of your story being embodied, this is where this comes from, that neurologically you have now been impacted. So sometimes people lean to what happened, but for those of us working in the area of trauma-informed, the most important question is how can we help? So what is needed in the immediacy? So this idea of tending to what is important to the individual. This is a nice graphic. Again, these slides will be shared with everybody, so I won't take you down through it, but just this idea of care being multidimensional, that we're thinking about physical health, we're thinking about mental health, we're thinking about behavioral distress, and that embodiment of not being able to find the words. We're looking at disrupted relationships, fragmented communities, and spirituality. So the principles that I talked about are evidenced in any care pathway that's looking at these 6 areas. So we're trying to promote resilience. And I suppose the other thing is trauma impacts people very differently. Some people are resourced in different ways. So the impact of a similar trauma can actually be so different for individuals that actually experience the same trauma, which is really important that we consider that. But we're thinking about efficacy, autonomy, connectedness, well-being, and that sense of hope. So in Callan Institute, we use a model called multi-element behaviour support model. And traditional behavioural kind of approaches, they're a little bit outdated now. They would focus on maybe changing the behaviour in the context of the topography, what the behaviour looks like. But in the multi-element behaviour support model, we've always embraced the principles that we're talking about in relation to trauma-informed care. And we're looking at functionality. We're thinking about how can we, together with the person, understand their story, and how then can we respond to the message that's hidden in the distress, not to the behaviour itself, but actually to the distress. So this idea of taking our time to live and learn about the embodied story is really important in the multi-element behaviour support model. So I need is it's a valid message. We use empathic listening. So this looks at compassionate relating. So how do we think about the person's story in a way that is truly collaborative, that's respectful, that's culturally sensitive? We think about the circle of support, because their story here is really important, especially if the trauma is not a shared experience, but one individual in the circle of support has experienced this trauma. How do we think about vicarious trauma in the circle of support? So we really take our time to do that with the individual guiding us and considering how and who they think might be important to be part of this process. We all know the key principles of empathic listening, so I'm not going to go down through them, but the one maybe that is kind of nuanced is actually being able to name the feeling. So actually being able to say things like, I can see that you're angry, you're breathing very quickly. It is scary when a loud noise happens. I got a fright too, my heart is beating very fast. So that idea of attunement and mirror neurons is really important when we're thinking about trauma-informed and mindful environments. So we do spend a little bit of time working with the circle of support in the context of conversations, empathic listening, and thinking about how do we support this person on a day-to-day basis. We do have a support plan that's developed with the person and the person's story. That's maybe our mouse, so he's a play on words. It just reminds us that sometimes we need a big long tail to balance us. We need a magnifying glass to help us find the embodied story, and we go quietly and sensitively. Our plans will have 4 components. We're obviously thinking about the environment, and that can be the routine, the activities, the connections. So all of those things that were very important to us as we were living in COVID, these are all relevant when we're thinking about trauma-informed mindful environments. So we're thinking about exercise, predictability, we're thinking about similar routines, we're thinking about foods, we're thinking about bedtime and what that might look like. To think about the principle of empowerment and self-efficacy, we're thinking about skills. So we might be thinking about fun. We might be thinking about what information does this individual need. We might also be thinking about how we actually manage information and how we think about that, especially if the trauma is ongoing and current, even though it's not present in their lives, but it's actually happening around them. So sometimes maybe the publications of different documents, sometimes the media coverage can obviously be very, very challenging. We look at coping and tolerance. We do a lot of grounded kind of orientation to awareness around my breath, 5 things I can see, 5 things I can hear. We have we pull on a little bit of CBT in the context of discriminating. Is this real? Is it close to me? Is it far away? So we do a lot of skills. We then think about really focused areas. So where are the worries and the hotspots? So sometimes it can be bedtime routines. Sometimes it can be maybe when another family member leaves the house. So we're thinking about where do we really need to look at those kind of tender moments during the day. And we think about what might help there. We also then have how to respond when the person is acutely expressing, I am overwhelmed. So the trauma could still have been 4 years ago, 5 years ago, but that idea of that wave of being overwhelmed is something that's really important that the circle of support is able to consider. So you heard me saying we're thinking about the circle of support. So we need everybody's well to be resourced. So we think about circles of support and what they might need. So mums and dads, siblings, and friends. And these would be the 5 indicators that we would think about with circles of support. There's lots of resources available. So we sometimes can signpost so people can actually take on this role themselves. So this is just an example of the HSE mental health website. We do recognise that sometimes we actually need more help. So in trauma-informed care and pathways, we have a stepped approach. So we do recognise that if symptoms of trauma like difficulty concentrating, sleeplessness, irritability, if they're persisting for possibly longer than a month, we might need to think about asking for extra help. So we're very aware of the stepped approach with this. So I'm just going to finish up now. This idea of a trauma-informed mindful environment, it's blending this idea of inside the therapy room and outside as I live my life. So these are the 5 principles. They're relevant to all components of the system, including the circle of support. It requires collaborative working, and we have to always be linking and thinking about what the research is telling us. And as Maya Angelou says, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I just have some references there for you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Carol.